I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glenn.
Your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors. And you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, number 25, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability.
With a huge focus on gathering vital data over the last decade, 6 catchments and over 300 farmers participating in the programme with the aim of improving water quality. Eddy Burgess, Agricultural Catchments Specialist with the Teagasc Agricultural Catchments Programme, joins us to discuss nitrogen loss from agriculture. Eddy, you're extremely welcome to the show. Can you give us a little bit on the background of the Agricultural Catchments Programme, please?
I will, Deirdre. The programme is running for quite a while now. We're 13 or 14 years since the programme started. It took a year to select the 6 catchment areas that you mentioned and to instrument them up. But the Department of Agriculture fund the programme completely, and it's actually required as a part of the regulation for the Nitrates Directive and the derogation that each country monitors the rules. The European regulation requires that each country or each member state in Europe monitors the rules that are implemented to see are they being effective. So not every country has the same rules for the Nitrates Directive. Some countries have nitrate vulnerable zones, other countries have rules across the whole territory. And in different areas, different parts of Europe, there's different issues. So they would be focusing on different things and would have different, I suppose, tailored regulations for the issues that are likely in each country. But because of that, there is a review of those rules every 4 years, and the Agricultural Catchments Programme are monitoring the water at a very high resolution, in that we take a sample every 10 minutes and have been taking samples for numerous water quality parameters, would be the term for different aspects of water quality. We've been taking a sample every 10 minutes for the last 13 years in our 6 catchments. And it's with a view to seeing, are the regulations having an impact? Are they having enough of an impact, or do they need to be changed? And every 4 years, the regulations get reviewed in Brussels, and usually there are a change in the regulations. And from a farming point of view, that's happening just now, and there's a lot of concern because the EPA have been reporting of declining trends in water quality, and a lot of focus has come on nitrogen in the last 4 to 5 years. And I suppose as a result of that, Cathal, when we were arranging today's meeting, I said that we discussed nitrogen today to see can we shed some light, because as with all things in water, as I've learned over the last number of the time that I've been working with the Catchments Programme, it's never what it seems. There's always something else to it. There's always other aspects to it, and there's a lot of ironies with water quality. Things might do the exact opposite of what you would expect. Might not.
We need nitrogen to grow our crops, but it's almost like it's becoming a dirty word in recent years. What is the issue of nitrogen? Why is it the bad guy, or why is it shown up on the radar so much lately?
Yeah. Well, we do. Nitrogen is an essential element, and it's needed for plant growth. And there's a lot of nitrogen around us all the time. The air that we breathe is 78% nitrogen. Soil contains nitrogen naturally. A hectare of soil of grassland could contain over 15 tons of nitrogen, most of it tied up in organic matter. A tillage soil could be 5, 6, or maybe 7 tons of nitrogen. So there's nitrogen all around us, and it's cycling. The nitrogen cycle, we would have done it in school. It's moving and it's changing from one form of nitrogen to another the whole time. But it's an essential nutrient for crop growth. But from a water quality point of view, there are 2 aspects to water quality with nitrogen. Drinking water. For water to be safe to drink, there is a standard limit that the amount of nitrate should not exceed, and that's 11.3 is the figure of milligrams of nitrate per litre. And if it's in excess of that, it exceeds the drinking water standard, and it's deemed to be of a risk for a thing called blue baby syndrome. Babies have to get a transfusion, and this can add to the risk of that taking place. Almost all of the drinking water sources in Ireland are well below that standard of 11.3 milligrams per litre. And in comparison to most other European countries, our drinking water from a nitrate point of view is better, is good, or it is good and better than it is in a lot of other countries. So we're in a good place. A lot of our drinking water comes from the ground. It's groundwater. So you drill a hole, drill a borehole, put a pump into it and pump it out. And the standard of our drinking water from ground water is very good. And usually when it's in the ground, it has been filtered by the soil and there's very little other contaminants in it. So we're in a good place with the type of water that comes out of the ground from both a nitrate and other contamination point of view. But the other aspect where nitrogen is a problem is that it can, we spread nitrogen on the ground to grow grass or to grow crops. And if it's in water, it will also encourage growth. And it kind of disrupts the balance of what's naturally growing there. And if nitrate levels get high, it'll encourage algae to grow. And usually it's salty water where nitrogen is limiting. So a little bit of extra nitrogen getting into water that's salty, and I'm talking about the tidal zones below the last weir in the river or at sea. If those nitrate concentration in those receiving water bodies go above a certain limit, you will have more algae growing there than would be natural, and that in turn disrupts the ecosystem in that the algae sucks more oxygen out of water in its growth and its in subsequent death, and it can also lead to toxins. There's different types of algae that can be dangerous and poisonous and things like that, but it's mostly to do with the ecology that's living there is disturbed and not what we would like it to be. And the level we're talking about there, if we compare it to the drinking water standard, which was over 11, the ecological standard in our estuary is 2.6.
Yeah, we spoke to Jenny Deacon from the EPA last year as well, and she said she was a bit worried about exactly estuaries and groundwater popping back up the rivers and end up in the estuary. And we're all familiar now with algae blooms now, especially down on the coast or in our seaside towns and that. But I suppose, where are the main sources of nitrogen coming from in agriculture, Eddie?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned at the outset there that nitrogen is all around us and there's a lot of nitrogen in soil. And nitrogen in the soil, not in the organic form, but when nitrogen, bacteria in the soil feed on organic nitrogen, and they break it down in the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen gets converted from organic matter into nitrite and nitrate. And it's nitrate, ammonia and nitrate that plants can take. That's the form of nitrogen that growing crops utilize and take it out. And it dissolves in water, particularly nitrate. It's like dissolving a spoonful of sugar in your tea. Nitrate will dissolve in water. Now, that nitrate could come from the air. You'll have ammonia depositions. Usually that's not a lot. It could come from fertilizer that's been applied. It can come from urine patches. It can come from organic matter in the soil that's naturally been released. All of that is available for crop growth. And if we have a growing crop, a high yielding growing crop, and we hear of grass farmers now looking to grow 13, 14, or even up to 16, utilizing 13 or 14 and growing 16 tons of dry matter per hectare, it'll take a lot of nitrogen to grow that, more than the soil would naturally release out of organic matter. And if that's put out at the right time, you can have very good utilization of the nitrogen that was released naturally and the nitrogen that was applied. But if it's put out at a time when crop growth is slow, when soil temperatures are low and day length is short and you have less sunlight, and soils might be saturated, then the crop growth isn't as good, and that nitrogen will continue to dissolve in the water. And if there's a lot of water in the soil, gravity will pull that water down into groundwater. And once it's gone below the root zone, it's kind of lost to the growing crop. The roots of the crop have missed it, and that may well get pushed on into the groundwater and eventually end up in our streams. And when I said eventually twice there, because there is a time lag. That time lag could be a couple of hours. It could be a couple of days. It might be a season, or it could be 20 or 30 years. How long it takes water to travel from when it leaves the root zone to when it ends up in the river is, it's not a yes/no answer. Some water will travel quite quickly, and some soil types, some will get caught in humps and hollows in the bedrock, and some will move slowly, depending on the soil type and the bedrock and the parent material that's below it. So it becomes very complicated to understand how the nitrate travels from below the root zone to when it ends up in the stream. And farmers might do something now that is detrimental to water quality, and the results mightn't be found for another 3 or 4 years. Or equally, farmers could put in practice really beneficial measures where they're reducing their fertilizer application, or they're putting in catch crops or things like that. And the benefits from what they're doing equally could be delayed, and we might not see the response for a number of years.
Eddy, nitrogen loss can be associated or linked with particular soil types. Could you tell us a little more about this, Eddy? And are there any other factors that could be feeding into potential losses?
I think to try and get an understanding of how nitrogen is lost, you need to always come back to the fact that nitrate is carried as being completely dissolved in the water. And you need to try and get your thoughts around how is that water moving from when it leaves the root zone in the soil to when it ends up in the stream. And if you have a heavy clay, high clay content soil type, when it rains on that type of soil, a bigger portion of the water will flow off the surface and is not going to percolate down through the soil. So we don't have as much of the nitrate that is in the soil dissolving in the water, and more of the water is ending up in the stream from flowing across the surface. And in those cases, and in our catchments, we have catchments which that exactly is happening. The nitrate load, the amount of nitrogen leaving the catchment, or the concentration of nitrogen in the streams, are lower in comparison to ones that are free draining, where most of the rain that falls on the surface percolates through the soil. It passes down through the zone where nitrate is available. The nitrate is picked up by that water and is carried down into the groundwater, eventually ending up in the stream. And the nitrate in those catchments, generally speaking, is higher. And that is not always related to the intensity of the catchment. What I'm saying is, if you have a heavy soil type, you could have a much higher stocking rate and fertilizer application rate going onto the land, and have a much lower nitrate loss to the river, and vice versa. On a tillage catchment with free draining soil type, you might have a much lower application of nitrogen, but yet because of the pathway, the free draining nature of the soil, nitrate is being made available, it's getting picked up, and the nitrate concentration in the stream is higher. But also we need to think of the sources of nitrogen. I mentioned that nitrogen is all around us, and fertilizer and dung and slurry and urine patches being applied is one source of it, but it is there naturally. And tillage land where you're ploughing soil up will aerate the soil, and the bacteria living in the soil will break down organic matter and release nitrogen. And if we don't have a crop growing to take up that nitrogen, it will be available to get dissolved in the water and carried down, eventually ending up in springs into our streams. And that is one of the reasons that the current changes in the nitrates directive is looking for tillage farmers to establish green cover as quickly as possible after crops are harvested. Because in the autumn time of the year, generally speaking, you have stubbles and there isn't much growth, but soil temperatures are still high. Usually, not always, the weather changes from one year to the next, but usually days are getting shorter. There isn't as much drying conditions taking place. The soils begin to get damper. And when the soils are wet and it rains on them, it's almost like opening up the roadway for the nitrate to dissolve in the water and get carried down. And if there hasn't been a crop growing there to capture that nitrogen, it's available to get carried in the water as it percolates through the soil.
Eddie, you've mentioned the back end of the year, the autumn and tillage crops, and it's an important one. But I suppose the old saying, Ireland would be a lovely little country if you could put a roof on it, because the rain from one side of the country to the other is horrendous. How much of an impact does the seasonality or the weather or the winter versus spring temperature, amount of rain impact on nitrate and loss? Because you have mentioned a few times it's in the soil, but it has to be washed out of it.
Yeah. There is, in general, there is a seasonality to the concentration of nitrogen ending up in our streams, and this may contradict the time lag that I was discussing a little bit earlier, and I suppose it just all shows the complexity of it. But in general, nitrate levels are probably higher in the soil the closer you are to the surface. And I mentioned that it's the water flowing through the soil that carries that nitrogen. So if the water table is high, or if the rainwater gets into the water table quite quickly because it's high, the nitrate concentration tends to be higher. So I often heard, and still hear, that if you want to bore a well on your land for a water supply, September is a good month to do it, because the water table is at its lowest. And if you can get a good supply in September, it's going to supply you year round. And again, typically at that time of the year, if you look at the ditches and maybe land drains going around it, they're not flowing at that time of the year. The water table has gone lower. The ditches at the edge of your field are gone dry. Pipes taking drainage water off the land mightn't be flowing. But at this time of the year now, it's I know we've just come out of a very dry January, but typically there's a lot more water in the soil. Soils are saturated, field drains are flowing, and the water is flowing at a higher level in the soil. You don't have to go as deep to get the movement of water. And that nitrate, the water nitrate concentration, when you have streams being filled from a higher table, the concentration of nitrate is higher. So I mentioned we're taking a sample every 10 minutes, but if you're looking at the daily figure for nitrate, or the weekly or the monthly figure concentration for nitrate, we would notice that the nitrate concentration at this time of the year is probably at its highest. And it's at its lowest when the water table is at its lowest, maybe in the month of September, end of August, September, before the soils begin to, we call it the recharge period, when the soils begin to wet up again and the water table gets recharged. Before that happens, the nitrate concentration in the streams leaving it is usually at its lowest. And this came to an extreme in 2018. We had an exceptionally dry summer. And so dry that crop growth stopped. And crop growth didn't stop because of a lack of nitrogen. Crop growth stopped, the grass stopped growing because it didn't have any water. And putting nitrogen onto a crop that's suffering because of drought isn't going to fix it. It's like going to the dentist if you have an ingrown toenail.
Will he fix it for you?
And the soil was also naturally releasing nitrogen, but the soils dried out and cracked and became very aerated and open. And when it did rain that autumn, it rained really heavy. We had torrential downpours of rain, and the nitrogen that was in the soil, be that organic matter that got mineralized, chemical fertilizer that was applied, urine patches, all that nitrogen flushed very quickly through the dried out soil and ended up in our streams. And we saw peaks of nitrogen that we have never seen before in the Catchments programme. In some cases, double the highest nitrate levels that we've seen before. And catchments that normally have a heavy soil and would have had low nitrate levels had high nitrate. They had a high peak for nitrate.
Eddy, scientists and advisors working in catchments talk about this nitrogen load and the impact that it does have on water quality. Can you just tell us a little bit about what nitrogen load means?
Yeah, I can, and I have to admit, I was working in the Catchments programme for 4 or 5 years before I had the guts to admit that I didn't understand what load meant. But there's a difference between concentration and load. And I mentioned that nitrate can cause eutrophication. And if we think of the receiving water body, the receiving area that's going to be impacted, be that a drinking water source that you're going to take water out of, or an estuary that's going to have an algae bloom in it. It's the concentration that's in that receiving body, water body, that's important. We need to know, is the nitrogen above 2.6 in the estuary? That will cause a problem. In the groundwater, if it's above 11.3, that will cause a problem. But to get there, the river that's feeding into the estuary, it's delivering a load of nitrogen into that estuary. So we know the volume of water, and we can calculate the concentration of nitrogen in each gallon of water or each cubic meter leaving it. And we can average that out over the area that's been drained by that river. And rivers that are problematic where nitrogen is an issue, like the River Slaney or the River Barrow, which tend to be in our freer draining soil types, have an average load of between 20 and 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in the catchment leaving them. And that can vary. It can vary from one year to the next. In dry summers, that'll be higher. And if you have exceptionally wet years in a row, that will be lower. But it can be very easy to think that there is an excessively high load of nitrogen being applied to the land. And the more that you apply, the more there's going to be lost. And there is logic in that way of thinking, but that's not the whole story. It's not as simple as that. Obviously, the source has to be there in the first place, and the more that goes on, you have a greater source, the risk is going to be higher. But if you have a freer soil type, the risk is higher. If you have a drier summer, the risk is higher. And if you have the source of nitrogen being applied at the wrong time of the year, when you don't have growth to take it up, the risk is higher. It's not as simple as saying the load leaving the catchment is proportional to the load of fertilizer being applied. The risk is higher, but there are other factors that you need to consider. And if you have high crop offtakes, that will help reduce the risk.
Eddy, we have an awful lot to talk to, and I think we're going to have to get you back another time to go through some more. But I know the Agricultural Catchments Programme are running Agricultural Catchments Week starting from the 21st of February and running until the following Friday. Can you tell us what's planned and how we can assess that information?
Yeah, well, I suppose, as I mentioned, we're around for quite a while now in the Catchments Programme, and we've built up relationships with obviously with the farmers in the catchments, but also with other agencies and organizations over the years. And we have the theme of the week, which is coming from the 21st to the 25th, is working together for water quality. And there'll be a series of both podcasts and short video releases out over social media, covering the people that we're working with in the Catchments Programme and the work that we've done. So it kind of varies from Monday. On the first day, it'll be an overview of the programme, and myself and colleagues will give a bit of an overview. We have one of the farmers in our Timoleague catchment will give a talk. Just basically an overview of our daily work. The second day, on Tuesday, we're getting into our advisory and knowledge transfer work. So what we do to engage with the farmers. The third day, we're focusing on water quality research. And for the last 2 years, we've expanded our area of research to take in gaseous emissions. So we're looking at little bit on gaseous emissions, nitrogen fertilizer and white clover. And on the final day, the main topic is to do with our engagement in the education, agricultural education side of things. So we're a couple of the colleges, Ballyhaise and Clonakilty, will be featured on that day along with other works.
And I'm sure that can be all accessed through Teagasc social media and on the website.
Yes, yeah, yes, exactly, Cathal, on Teagasc social media and on the website, on the water quality section of our website, you'll be able to access those details, but also access those videos and the content. But also, if you want to look up and see specifically what you want to look at, the details are all there at the moment on teagasc.ie environment water quality.
Yeah, look, Eddie, the Agricultural Catchments Programme is a hugely important programme coming out of Teagasc and a huge amount of benefit towards the agricultural industry. So I think it's really important for any farmers or anyone involved in the industry to remember that improving water quality is a vital part of protecting our industry going forward. So Eddie, look, we really enjoyed that chat and we certainly will have you back if you'll come, and best of luck with Catchments Week, Agricultural Catchments Week. Thanks a million for your time.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks very much, Cathal and Deirdre.
That's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. Thanks to Eddy Burgess, Agricultural Catchments Specialist with the Teagasc Agricultural Catchments Programme, for joining us on the show.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glenn.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.